Thank you for coming today, and I really appreciate your interest in my topic, which is Kings and Pyramids in the Sudan, the Second Kingdom of Kush and Nubia. Now, there are three different kingdoms in Nubia. The first one has a capital at a place called Kerma. Someone else in this series will be discussing Kerma. And the third kingdom has a capital at Merowe, and that's also the purview of someone else in the series. I've got the second kingdom, which is the kingdom that produced much of the material in the exhibition. How many of you have seen the exhibition already? Oh, quite a lot, so that's wonderful, that's super. On the outline today, section number 1, the introduction, the kind of when, where, who, what. I'd like to use this part to talk about the kingdom of Cush itself, what might be the basis of its economy, something about the state, perhaps, and how it's functioned, organization, that sort of thing. And in the second kingdom, we're going to talk about two different periods or phases of that. The first one will be the 25th dynasty, and you should have on your outline, you ought to be able to see the outline that was given to you in your handout. Because the dates are on this outline, it'll be easier for you. You don't have to write them down, just look at them. The 25th dynasty kings are the kings that ruled Egypt. And then there are the Napatan kings, who are the kings that went back to the Sudan after they were thrown out of Egypt by the Assyrians, and who ruled in the Sudan for another several hundred years. Then the capital changed to Merowe, and you're talking about the third kingdom of Nubia. And the last part of it is kind of a conclusion in which I'd like to wrap up a little bit of what we've learned about the kingdom itself and the society, and then what have we learned from taking a look at these kings and their tombs, because this is sort of my specialty. And my very favorite thing is to take a picture of something Nubian and have someone say, well, that looks Egyptian. And I can say yes, or I can start talking for 6 hours about why it looks Egyptian, but it isn't really Egyptian. So I don't want to talk for 6 hours, I just want to talk for my allotted hour and 15 minutes, and that's all I will do. But we're going to look a lot, in order, if we want to learn about the Cushites, which is the kind of the point of my talk here, we need to know why so many people think they look Egyptian. Egyptologists think that too, and they have this terrible problem, the Cushites. Egyptologists look at their stuff and say, that's Egyptian. Let me read it and see what the content is. And then an Egyptologist reads it and sees what the content is and says, oh, that's not Egyptian. They don't know what they're doing. This is just all junk. They've used Egyptian pictures and something else, and I can't read it, so they're wrong. This is not the attitude that I have. And you're going to go on a little journey with me as we pick some things apart and look at why they're not Egyptian, what is Cushite about them, and what that actually means. So, first of all, you can see the location of Nubia here, where the Nile sort of lies on its side in an S-shaped inside that circle. That's Nubia. And it's more a geographical area than a political area, particularly now. But what we're talking about mostly will be in the center area. This is where Napata is, and this is where the center kingdom is, the second kingdom. If you look back at your handouts, I've got a couple of lists here. One of them we're going to talk about, which is some differences between Cush and Egypt. And then the one on the second page, which is about Sudanic trading kingdoms, Sudanic here meaning sub-Saharan. That's something you should have a look at after the lecture is over and see if you can remember, kind of piece it together, what we said about the kingdom, and see how much you think Cush might actually be the first of a number of large and important trading kingdoms. And I know that one of the later speakers wants to talk about this as well, so if you've signed up for the whole thing, this will help you prepare for her talk. That's Janice Yellen, whom I would like to thank very, very much for helping me get my head together on this talk. Take a look first at the agricultural lands are limited under Cush. You know, in Egypt, there are plenty of places where the Nile floods the land and then it's prepared for crops, or where you can build irrigation systems and irrigate areas. So there's quite a lot of arable land in Egypt, and that's why one reason why it was called the breadbox of the Roman Empire, right? That is not so true in Cush. There is arable land, you can do some irrigation, but a lot of the land is not really useful for agriculture, and that means that it's only the population around those areas, mostly, that is settled. And there are a lot of transhumant pastoralists in the Sudan who were here in one season with their animals, then there in the next season with their animals. So it's a very mixed population, and groups of people who are doing this, that, and the other thing. And there is a centralized government during all of the periods that we know about, but it's probably not very strong, and the boundaries are not necessarily very clear. I mean, there's probably not a line in the sand where you can say, okay, you are part of my empire, and you are not, to somebody just a couple feet away. The court is probably peripatetic in the sense that they wandered around for crownings of the king. The kings did travel around the kingdom. They were crowned in many, many temples. On the other hand, the population in Egypt was quite settled. There were a few people out in the desert, but mostly people were along the Nile and in these big stone temples. They were worshiping or working, and it wasn't, there just weren't so many people who were not necessarily connected to the government and identifiable by the government. Food production is clearly the basis of the Egyptian economy, but Cush in all periods has been a trading center. And we're going to see some evidence of that now. First of all, the people of Cush are pictured here on a box belonging to Tutankhamun. He's in Cush on this box, fighting against the Cushites, because it was in his time, a little earlier and a little before, when the Egyptians were trying to take over Cush and rule it. So he's pictured many, many Nubians, and right over there, oh, sorry about that. Right here is the word Cush, labeling the people in the slide. And you can see there it is kind of a mix of people, but it's largely darker skinned people who were the Cushites in these slides. You can see here rows of Cushites bringing gifts to the governor, Amenhotep Hui. This is also the time of Tutankhamun. Over here you see gold. The gold is dug up, and in the Sudan, it's mined in the Sudan, and it's turned into gold rings so it's easier to ship. They also sell and trade cattle, lots of cattle coming along here, and the skins of animals as well. You can see used to make chairs, used to make shields, ebony products, chairs, headrests out of ebony. There's more gold down there. This is another group from another tomb, but you can also see different products here. Live animals from Central Africa, different kinds of monkeys, hamadryas, baboons, I think, here. These big chunks of black wood or ebony, and there's an elephant tusk right there. So they have access to Central Africa, and they're bringing those goods up through Egypt, and they're giving them as gifts. They're selling them, they're trading them, and they're probably also paying taxes with them because there were taxes then, and the Egyptians wanted their money. I said that they do the gold mining in the Sudan as well, and you can see over here on the left is a mine, an area of mines. They didn't go underground to mine. They came at the veins of gold from the top. So you can identify these places in the landscape because there are very deep holes there. Some of them went down 20 meters, maybe 30 meters, and they approached it from the ground going down. And then there's a lot of grinding of the stones and pebbles they found that had gold in them, and you can see some of these grinding stones lying about the landscape. So if you go there on a trip, that's how you'll identify the gold mines, and don't get caught on your hands and knees picking through looking for gold nuggets. All of these little gold rings here show you where in the Sudan there are gold mines. So no, it's kind of no wonder that this is the place that was known for the gold. This is the Nile coming down here. You see that? And then it branches over here where the Blue Nile goes to Lake Tana in Ethiopia, and the White Nile comes down that way. The Blue Nile is passable. The White Nile, much less so. Now, the other question is, you'll see on the list of trading empires in Africa, characteristics that most of the goods traded are raw materials, and that's what we see in those pictures of the Cushites trading and bringing their goods. They did some manufacturing in the kingdom too. One thing they're very well known for is the pottery on the left. This is more from the Third Kingdom than from the earlier two kingdoms, but there's also beautiful pottery in the First Kingdom as well. Amazing, beautiful stuff. They also, this is one of the earliest places in Africa, if not the earliest, to work iron. And we know that that started around 750 BC, and it was a locally developed industry, and there was quite a lot of iron produced. These things are light enough to be transported around, so it's quite possible that they were also trading manufactured goods. The pottery I'm not sure about. I know they traded within their own kind of area. Whether they went outside of that is very hard to say because there hasn't been a lot of excavation in some of the places that we think they went. So we aren't really finding pieces of Meroitic pottery somewhere where we think they traded. Also the gold, we know that they were selling that and trading that, and they also had wonderful workmen. So it wasn't just a raw material when it was sent out and traded. It was possible that it was a finished goods here. Interestingly, and most people don't know this, the Cushites trained and raised horses, and they were very well known for that. The Assyrians really liked these horses because they were bigger and stronger than the horses the Assyrians had access to. And we've got texts in cuneiform where people are receiving shipments of Cushite horses. Done it again. Cushite horses here, as many as 98 horses brought in during the day. I'm not saying they walked those 98 horses all the way from Khartoum, because I think that's pretty unlikely. But they could have had stations along the way where they were holding horses, breeding horses, training horses, and then when they had a sale, then they moved the horses, and it will have been a much shorter distance. Here are some of the trade routes. You've got the Nile coming down, that's this blue thing. This is the famous Korosko Road going from Abu Hamed up to the Nile and into Egypt, and this helps you avoid the cataracts in Egypt, impassable places in the river. There's the famous Bayuda Road here. This, the Wadi Hawar, goes all the way over to Chad, and there are a lot of people who think that this was just the beginning of the route to the western part of Africa, and yeah, we need a little more excavation over there to know if we could really find Cushite goods. If they're raw materials, maybe not. That might be pretty hard to find raw materials because they deteriorate in hot and wet weather. Some of the things wouldn't necessarily be found in a big heap. If you were selling arrowheads, for example, you might find them out in the jungle or in the woods where somebody used one to kill an animal, but it's not likely to be just exactly where the archaeologist looks. So it's going to be pretty hard to say, yes, they were trading this or that. There's another trade route going over to Chad down here. Over this way, you can see that there are routes up to Suakin and Port Sudan on the Red Sea, and we know they traded into Saudi Arabia. And then this Blue Nile coming down here to Lake Tana, that might have been a route into Central Africa for them. And the other thing I want you to know about the Cushites before we really switch to my part of the topics here, the Egyptians were frightened to death of them. They had a reputation for being bowmen and great archers, and the Egyptians built a whole series of these enormous forts, like you see over here. This is Buhen, and this looks like a medieval castle, and it has an awful lot of technical advantages that medieval castles have. So the Egyptians were really scrambling to protect themselves from Cushites coming up from the south. This fort is Mirgasa. This one has been drowned by the Lake Aswan, and so we really can't see that anymore. But there is someone coming who's going to talk about one of the forts to you. That will happen later in the series as well. The first kingdom of Cush is Kerma, and I'm not talking about it more than just this one slide. You can see very interesting architecture, square, maybe Middle Eastern architecture, round and semicircular, maybe Central African architecture, a big mixture of things going on at Kerma, and it starts very early, around 2600 BC, we start to see an urban center building up, and this, of course, is the oldest urban center in Africa that we have found so far. Kerma ends as a separate state and begins as an object of the Egyptian government, its occupation of it, around 1550 BC. And that period lasts about 500 years. And then by around 1070 BC, Nubia is empty of colonizers, and something is going on. We see that people were living there. We don't see much evidence of the rise of kings until later, perhaps around 900 BC. And this all happens around Napata, which is right there in the center on the bend of the Nile. Kerma's over there. And we're going to look at two cemeteries here, Kurru and Nuri. And these, I'm affiliated with the archaeological dig at Nuri. And using the belongings of the elites, the kings, and the tombs at those two cemeteries, we're going to try to answer the question why this looks so Egyptian and why a kingdom that has so much going for it, trading all over the known world, in fact, and places that Europeans didn't know either, why are they using Egyptian motifs and building Egyptian-type buildings and tombs? Well, there are a couple things in Napata that made people want to live here. First of all is this great big temple, started by the Egyptians but continued and expanded. There's someone who will be coming later who will talk about this too. But the area of Napata has got a lot of really attractive things in it if you're the king and you want to find a place to put your palace and your capital. Nuri is the first cemetery we'll look at. You can see there are rather a lot of pyramids here and a lot more that you can't see because the queens of the kings are also buried in this cemetery. And here's El Kurru. This is the one that I'd like to start with. Don't worry about the names of the kings and queens. You can't see, if you go to Kurru, you can't see these kings' buildings anyway, largely. There's not much on the surface left at Kurru because people in the neighboring towns took all the blocks and built themselves houses, and in earlier periods built themselves churches with these blocks. But there is a development of tombs here which was identified by an MFA curator, George Andrew Reisner, who was for about 40 years, I think, the curator of the Egyptian department. And if you start here, what you see is kind of a round mound, and underneath it are just two holes in the ground. This is really typical for certain periods, earlier periods of the Sudan, and there actually are people being buried in tombs that look like this right now in the Sudan. So this is a very typical Sudanese-type burial situation. It's a hole in the ground, and off to the bottom of the side of it is a little burial chamber where the deceased is put, and then there's something heaped up on the top, various things in various periods, but that protects the grave from animals and it marks the location. As you can see, as people start to use this cemetery more, it gets a little bit more elaborate, but the actual burial location is the same. It's pretty much still this pit going down with a room off to the side. But as soon as they get to Egypt and they become kings of Egypt, wham, we've got a pyramid. Now, there's nothing naturally leading to a pyramid, particularly, about this chain of development. So when you get here and you see a pyramid, you can say, okay, this is a choice. This didn't happen by accident. This didn't happen because they wanted pyramids, just like the Egyptians had them. They've decided we're going to put a pyramid here. And this is not a typical Egyptian pyramid. Typical Egyptian pyramid might have rooms inside it, or it will at least have rooms right under it that are accessible from the outside of the pyramid, maybe in the chapel area. This is like a model of a pyramid plopped down on the ground. And then under the access to it is a staircase way out here. You can see this right there. It comes down. there are 3 rooms in a line. They're not like off a corridor like the Egyptians might have a series of rooms, like a kind of shotgun house. These look like the kind of shotgun style of Southern American architecture. And no access to the pyramid at all, okay? And then this staircase is filled in, and you can't see it. Theoretically, you can't see it. You don't know how to get into the pyramid. So, yeah, it looks like an Egyptian arrangement, but in fact, it's kind of like a little toy pyramid there. It doesn't do anything except look like a pyramid. It doesn't have any real purpose. I mean, except to look like a pyramid. And that's the point, right? You're king of Egypt. You get a pyramid, for heaven's sakes. And here's Piye, and he's the first actual recognized Cushite king of Egypt, and you can see the way his pyramid looks. Now, they've taken the top away to build other things with it, but you can see the descendery going down here, and you can see that there are the rooms down at the bottom, and there's no access. This hole up here that is letting light into the burial chamber, this hole is just there because so much of the stone has been robbed. There would not have been a connection before this. Okay, so let's talk about Piye for a couple of minutes. He consolidates the kingdom in Egypt, and the other thing he does is introduce a new style of writing. He does a victory stela, and whoever composed the victory stela really was a grammar nerd. He went and looked at Egyptian grammar and said, okay, I don't want to compose this in the kind of language you people are speaking now. I want something more classical and something more formal and more elegant, and went back to the grammar and did that. Took forms from the earlier language and created something that was a bit more elegant, and then they wrote this fabulous stela which has poetry in it and some extracts from military journals and a lot of other things like that, but not only that, also evidence about his personality. I mean, check this out. Piye went out to his soldiers and he said, stop attacking people at night. Don't do that. And he said, when the enemy isn't there, just sit quietly and wait for them until they get there and tell you that they're ready. Now, I'm not sure this would wash in today's military circles, but the man had a reputation for being very pious and just and fair, and it kind of sounds with this kind of stuff as if maybe he was like that. I mean, what a shock that the rumor of someone's behavior would actually turn out to be true, and it's positive. Also, people who've studied the stela have said that it's really an operatic performance of language and content mixed together. And that's really kind of a strong statement for an Egyptologist to make, so it means something. Next king is Shabaka. Here are his dates. And this is the most interesting thing from his reign. I'm putting check marks on things that are unique and things that may look Egyptian but possibly aren't really Egyptian. Things that don't appear anywhere except from Kush and at this period. So it's hard to say that this is Kush. Some people think the Kushites wrote this. Some people think, and they say that they found it in a library and they dragged it out and they refurbished it. It's the actual stone, yes, they did do it, but the story that's on the stone, not so clear. And then it was used as a grinder, a wheat mill, And so that accounts for all the marks in the center of it. But this is an account of creation, and those in the Judeo-Christian tradition will recognize the idea of creation by thought and word. And that's exactly what this account repeats. For the god Ptah, who wished to create the world, he thinks about what he wants, he utters it, and a god appears who creates it for him. So this is really quite a remarkable document, no matter who wrote it. And because the Cushites put it out there, I'm giving them a red check. Next king of also very great importance is Taharqa. He's known as a builder in the Sudan, but also in Egypt. And he's called the savior of Jerusalem. So in around 701 BC, the Assyrian king Sennacherib hears this rumor that somebody has talked to Taharqa and has invited him up to the Sudan, from the Sudan to Judah, which is a part of Israel, and he's asked him to fight Sennacherib's armies. And yeah, this is a little scary because the Assyrians were particularly nasty people to fight. And we also want to know why Taharqa is allied with Judah at this point. And an Israeli scholar whom I'm really proud to know, Daniel Kahn, says that this was all about trade routes, that the Cushites were allied with Judah at this point, controlling trade routes in the Levant, and Sennacherib and the Assyrians wanted them. And of course they did. So happily, Taharqa's forces did succeed in keeping Judah away from the Assyrians, at least for a while, and they both kept control of the trade in the Levant. Here's the place where the battle happened at El Teka, and it's just a little northwest of Jerusalem. Now, there were famous earlier battles at Megiddo, but this is much, much later in the south. And here, after Taharqa won this battle, he later became king in Egypt and in Cush, and he was attacked again by Sennacherib in Egypt, and Sennacherib came further into Egypt and took his son. And this is Taharqa's little boy in Assyria, kneeling in front of Sennacherib and begging for his life, along with someone else they took as a captive. So Taharqa had a hard time at the end of it, and he may have died in Thebes. But the next king is Tanutamani. You can see him over there on the right. And he's buried at El Kurru. And he gets 2 check marks now. First of all, he built his mother a tomb and himself a tomb. So he gets a check mark for being nice to his mother. We also have to give him a check mark because not only was he nice to his mother, but basically this is a new and different thing. Mothers in Egypt get buried in the Valley of the Queens. Not in the Valley of the Kings where the pharaohs go, but in the Valley of the Queens. Here in Cush, your mother gets buried right beside you, and her tomb may be identical to yours. In other words, everything that happens for you as a pharaoh happens for her as the pharaoh's mother. Now, there's a deal. Actually, we've got 2 check marks already, but I have to give them one more. The other thing that gives them a check mark here is that they've taken, in order to create this tomb, they've taken an Egyptian underworld book and they've ripped it apart and they've thrown some things out and they've put some other things in that they like better. And that's always something that's going to make me happy, because that enables me to talk about it for longer. Here's an example of that underworld book that they used. And this is called The Awakening of Osiris and the Transit of the Solar Barks. And you know Osiris is the Egyptian god of the dead, and he comes back to life. He's brought back to life. And when you die and I die, we get to be a sort of Osiris, and we can be brought back to life as well. So here is Ramses the Ninth, and he's back alive, up on his elbows, on top of his bier. He's been dead, but now he's up resting on his elbows, looking around. Hey, where am I? What's going on here? Okay? There are some people in the room who have been watching over him during the night before his resurrection. And in the tomb of Ramses the Ninth, you see boats up here as well. So this is happening as a heavenly experience, I think, for Ramses the Ninth. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. These are the waters of heaven on which the boats will sail. So what do the Cushites do with this? It's very cool. We take out the boats because we're not in heaven anymore. We're down underground in a tomb, so we're changing the location. And here is Kalhada, the mother of Tanu Tamani. I'm only using her tomb because her tomb is better preserved than his is, so it's much nicer for you to look at. She's up on her elbows, checking it out as well. The people who are watching over them during the night are over here, and then behind the guy who's lighting this up. Okay, so this is the awakening that you saw before in the tomb of Ramses the Ninth. But guess what? Kalhada and Tanu Tamani have a whole other scene that they have added. The people who watched over them are still here. They're still lying on the bed, but this is the royal corpse dead. So this is before the resurrection of the king, and the one that we looked at previous to this is after the resurrection of the king. So you go from before to after, which means that what's in the middle is probably the crucial resurrection. And here it is. This is the king, or Kalhada, or Ramses the Ninth, whoever, even a private individual later, lying on the back, dead, watched over by these, they're called the Hour Watchers. And here's the king, Ramses the Ninth, Kalhada, whoever, up on their elbows, and right above is the word awake. So you don't miss it. Person is alive again, not sleeping, awake. And right there in the center is where this is happening. That's where the bier is in a Cushite tomb. The bier not being the thing that you drink, but the thing that your body lies on when you're deceased. And here is the bier from Kalhada's tomb. Her body goes from dead over there, resurrection in the bier, on the bier, and then back to this scene right here where she's on her elbows. So if you look at that, I mean, that is the scene of a performance for starters. I mean, not that there's room there for a lot of people. There isn't room for a lot of people, but you don't have to have an audience to do a performance, to do a magical performance, to bring someone back to life. You don't need an audience. So here we are, and I want you to notice, we were looking at a whole room before and a reconstruction of a scene which has turned that room into a resurrection chamber. And where did the Cushites get that idea? From a little painting, all restricted within 3 sets of lines, all contained like this. not breaking its bounds and becoming the thing that it really is, which is the resurrection of a human being, but it's just a little painting on the wall. It's supposed to remind you that this is going to happen. But the Cushites have made it into a huge thing. They've turned a whole room into it. They've really got the place where it happened. Again, we've got these other things going on here. There's the water for the heaven. The Cushites have taken that out. Here's another sign that this is happening in heaven, a sun disk with wings. The Cushites do have boats in the room and sun disks, but they're not so much a part, an integral part of this scene here. And then the thing that really caps it off at the end is that the butt end of the room, like off to your right and left as you come into the room, has sticks stuck in the ground, and on the top of the sticks are the masks of the priests who played the roles of the gods that brought the king or the queen back to life. I mean, this is astounding. Absolutely astounding. The imagination, the ingenious design of it, the nerve to take an Egyptian, a holy Egyptian book of the afterworld, and rip it apart and redo it. It's just unbelievable. Unbelievable. Okay, Tanu Tamani is returned to Cush by the Assyrians, and Cushite rule in Egypt ends. And this happens when the Assyrian Ashurbanipal sacks the city of Thebes. And the sack of Thebes was so terrible, so horrible, that it later became a byword in Greek and Roman civilization, a byword for horror, for destruction, for death. And you can see this is one of the Nimrud ivories, and the lion Ashurbanipal is proceeding to eat the Cushite defender of Thebes. This is also kind of sad. When those kings came back after Tanu Tamani, they chose to be buried in a different place. And that place is Nuri. And we can see the pyramids here because they haven't completely been torn down. What's mostly been torn down at Nuri are the mortuary chapels. And this partly because the ground underneath these pyramids is very wet. And the rooms have got water in them, frankly, and it's destroying the stone, and they aren't very safe, and we'll talk about that in a minute. First king is Atlanersa, and you can see here the beginnings of his pyramid, what's left of it, and down in the right corner is an offering table on a podium. And here's a close-up of that. The offering table has pictures of food on it, usually, and then a runnel going around it. So you pour a libation on this, milk, wine, water. It picks up the goodness and the magic from the food. It runs out the spout. It goes down into the ground to the king's chamber and feeds him, nourishes the king. Interestingly, this is located where there was a rite doing exactly that. And it comes from the chapel of Atlanersa, and this is the first evidence we have that there's a mortuary ritual happening in the chapels. Even if they're not there anymore, there's a niche in the end of the chapel, and it's happening before the niche. This niche, we know from later versions, is the way the king comes up from the burial chamber and enters the now living community in the chapel. The Sudanese were very big on ancestor rituals, and this gets a couple of check marks, although there's only one on this slide. First of all, because the rituals were put together by going to libraries and saying, let's see now, we want to do this and this, so let's take that from this Egyptian ritual and that from another one, and let's mix them all up and put them in the order we want of them, and voila, we have our own ritual. And not only this, but the Egyptians did also have ancestor kings, but they did rituals for them in a group, like you went into a big, huge temple, and if they did ancestor rituals there, they had the names of the kings and the figures of the kings all over the place, and then there were a couple of priests doing one pouring of libation on one offering table. The Cushites felt that each king had to have their own, so they get another check mark for changing an Egyptian ritual to the way they wanted. Same time as Atlanersa is his wife, and her name is Irtieru, and she had a very nice painted burial chamber at Kurru at Nuri. Excuse me. And I want to thank the Nuri Archaeological Expedition for letting me use this photograph. Here's a perfect example of a place where an Egyptologist goes in and says, Egyptian. Wait a minute. I don't like the text. The text shouldn't be there. That's the wrong text. Oh, well, they didn't know what they were doing, did they? This is Irtieru as the deceased, and here's her prayer to give me a good burial, and there's the god Osiris, god of the dead, and behind him his wife Isis. And then over here are these mummified figures. They're divine, surely, but they're all dressed up as mummies, and above is a text, and then in front of each one of them are little columns of text that come down. This is an exact copy of this particular room from Thebes, which is a little bit earlier, belonged to a man named Karakamun. And this is really hard to look at, and I apologize for the quality of the slide, but the people who excavated this want to use the best slides in their publication, so I couldn't get one for you. But if you look over here, there are the mummies, the mummified figures standing, and there's a line of text between each one. So you got the side walls exactly the same way. And then down here is Osiris seated, Isis behind him, an offering table, which the other scene has two, but it's also destroyed, so you can't see it. And then it's unclear, but the deceased is certainly here, and there is room for something else over there, but I'm not quite sure what that is. So she's using a model for something. She's using the same layout as this tomb. Well, that in itself is interesting because there's some thousands of miles between these two tombs, and it's very interesting that she knew what this tomb looked like. Here are some black and whites of the side wall, and you can see the mummiform figures there and the lines of text in front of them. Now, these come, the visual idea of this comes from something called the negative confession, which is happening in an Egyptian papyrus right here at the top, and the Egyptians did have a kind of confession. Ours is we go and we say, I did this, and I'm really sorry, and I'd like to be absolved of my guilt, and what's my penance? And the Egyptians solved all of the apology part. I'm being sarcastic here because I do think, and there's a lot of evidence that they really did believe this. They had a list of crimes, and their confession was to say, I did not do it. I did not do this, I did not do that, I did not do the other thing. And so you can see her up here, and there will be a text for all of this. She's addressing these mummiform figures, and she's doing her negative confession. And as soon as she's finished with that, her heart is weighed down here on this scale against a feather of the goddess of truth. And if her heart is weighed down by the lies that she told in the confession, it sinks right to the floor, and she's eaten by a monster over here. But if they stay even, that means her heart is not weighed down by any deception. And she's able to move into the presence of Osiris over there on the far end. And she gets to start eating food and drinking and behaving like the jubilant person she really ought to be, because she's passed her test in the afterlife. And it's really interesting that at this period in Egypt, people are, not only in Egypt, actually in the whole Mediterranean, people are starting to think of what role morality should play in religion. Maybe they should be connected in somehow, because that wasn't immediately true when people started to behave in religious ways. It wasn't necessarily true that a religious way of behaving was a moral way of behaving. But this is coming in, and it's becoming popular. It becomes very popular in Cush, and especially for the ruling classes where we can see this documented, we know that the belief in this kind of responsibility for your behavior continues on to the end of the kingdom. Now, the Egyptians would also put this, for example, on a coffin or a sarcophagus, and you can see all the mummiform gods lined up, and here's the negative confession. The gods are associated with a particular kind of sin, and so that's why the negative confession is separating them. That's the negative confession for the sin that the god is responsible for, or looks over, or watches. Anyway, we go back to Irtieru, and we've still got that Egyptologist saying, but the text is wrong. The text is about food. That's not about sin. Well, that's what she did. She used the layout and perhaps magically gets the benefit of the negative confession. But she's also pulled the text out and put something else in, which is about her having a nice burial and a comfortable afterlife and all the food and drink that she needs. And she's solved that problem too. So it's not entirely clear why she did this. I don't really know, and I would like to know, because I'm publishing an article on it, and I better figure it out. I think what's happened is that she's buried in one of those little queen's pyramids I mentioned when I showed you the picture of Nuri. And she didn't have a mortuary chapel. Now, the mortuary chapel, even for private people, this is where your family comes once or twice a year, and they bring a picnic, and they sit down, and they have a meal with you. And it's like going to the cemetery and having a picnic beside your loved one's resting place. Brings families together. It was very, very popular. If she didn't have a chapel, there was no place that her family could do that. So she needed to be assured that she'd be fed, and this kind of magical setup will do that, because eternally these painted mummiform figures will ask Osiris to give her sustenance in the afterlife, and that way she's kind of got her insurance. The next king is Senkominiskun. I don't see a lot of evidence in his reign for having messed about with Egyptian ideas. On the other hand, there's not much evidence from his reign in any case. But you can see there's a serious attempt to really decorate these underground chambers, starting with his tomb, to carve doors, little doorways to the underworld, right, like you've got over here, larger doorways to pass from one of the chambers to another. And here is Senkominiskyn's negative confession. You can see he's got his mummiform figures inside the column. Instead of having the columns in front of him, he's inside of them. And right there is the negative word where the part comes that says, I didn't do that. And this too. And you know what that sign is on the top? It's your arms coming out like this. I didn't do it. I didn't do it, really. And here's Senkominiskyn in the niche, in his chapel, right where they would perform the rite. And this just tells us that this rite is performed for the Osiris, who is the god of the underworld, but who is also the dead king. So this is a rite for the dead ancestor, a mortuary rite for the dead. And there's an example, there are a lot of examples of Osiris in these doorways, but here's another one from the tomb of Karakomun in the Asasif. Next king is Anlamani. We're going to talk about the sarcophagi of Anlamani and his brother Espelta, and that was my doctoral dissertation, so I'll try not to talk. I've still got 15 minutes. Woo, I can talk as long as I want. I had to put that in here. This is a little piece of clay with the impression of a baby's foot. Is that not cute? Does that not remind all the grandparents in the room of that little footprint you've got, or those little silvered shoes, or whatever? It just makes them so human that I couldn't pass that up. And this is Anlamani with the horns of the god Amun as a part of his crown. And he's the first one to put a text on that stela in the mortuary chapel. So he went to the library, or he sent, more likely, someone to the library, and he said, I want my own mortuary rite, and I would like you to go, and well, let's have a libation of this and this and a couple of other things and put them in this order, and you go find me some nice Egyptian texts so that it's really cool when I have my mortuary rite. And this is what it came out to look like. And this is very nice, but it's very different from the ones that came after it. And this is another thing I like, and another reason I've got red check marks all over the place, because the kings, and you can see after Anlamani, there's Espelta, Amani Astabarka, Sias Pico, Malawibamani, and Talakamani. They all changed the rite. They looked at the rite and said, well, this isn't exactly what I want for myself, so let's change this, this, and this. And when I lined all the stelae up, they just got longer and longer and longer because nobody discarded anything, but they kept adding stuff. But this is really an intellectual way of looking at the situation, number one. Number two, and the state is not dictating how a king has to be buried. The king can decide what's going to happen when he's buried. And this here is my failed attempt to take a picture of the stela of Sias Pico in the Cartoon Museum. But it's just that simple offering scene that we saw from Irtiero. It's the deceased right here with an offering table before Osiris, and behind him, his wife, Isis. The other thing he created was he looked at the wooden sarcophagi in Egypt, which are called carycettes, and which have posts at the corner and little Horus falcons and little Anubis jackals sitting on the top. And he said, I'm going to have one in stone. And so they made this huge, incredibly heavy thing for him. And again, he sent people to the library And he said, I don't want this decorated the way it's fashionable in Egypt now to decorate a Keraset sarcophagus. I want you to make this a collection of the most important of Egyptian funerary texts that you can find. And so this is really a library. There are all, what you see on the foot outside is the canonical foot exterior of a sarcophagus, starting from about the 18th dynasty on the way up. And there are selections made from the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom and all over Egypt and all kinds of time periods. So it's really a sort of library. It's like a Reader's Digest reader of mortuary literature for the kings. It's amazing. And he gets a red check mark from that, as you can imagine. And I think that this library was at Jebel Barkal. I mean, where else would it be? Libraries tended to be in temples. This would have been a big library suitable for the holdings of a really large temple. It had to have been in a central place where people could get at it, a place that was taken care of for a long time. It's a possibility anyway. But the person who in this lecture series will talk about that may or may not mention a library, but you can ask if you want to. It's Tim Kendall, and tell him I asked. In the spirit of doing your brother a bigger one and a better one, this is the brother of Alamani, Espelta, who did a sarcophagus for himself, and it's a lot bigger. And he added more text, of course, without taking any more out. So his is even more imposing, and you can see the little falcon up here, and at the foot end is Anubis with his tail hanging down the outside of the coffin. If you'd like to see a reproduction of Espelta's burial chamber, and it's a very, very realistic one, very well done, in fact by this same Tim Kendall, who was a member of the Egyptian department for some years, go to the Museum of the National Center of Afro-American Artists on Walnut Street in Roxbury, because they have the reconstruction of this burial chamber plus a reconstruction of the coffin in it. And you can see the little doors to the underworld that we saw in Senkameniskan. It's really quite wonderful to see what one of these things would have looked like. And it's got that idea that the papyrus, a book of the dead, has been rolled out along the wall. So you see the columns of text and the little pictures, and then more columns of text and more little pictures illustrating them. Now, the last tomb at Nuri, I don't have time to talk about it anymore, too bad, is Nastasen. He's the last king before they move the capital to Meroe, and it becomes a very different looking kingdom when that happens. I told you these tombs are full of water, and this is turning out to be the first underwater excavation in a pyramid that has ever been done. Because the burial chamber, as you can see, has got a lot of water in it and varies from day to day. So sometimes it's really up here, and you've just barely got room to stick your head out. And other times it's a little lower, and you can actually do some work. But it's really interesting what they're doing there. Okay. If you can believe it, am just about done. But I want you to think a little bit about what we talked about in the beginning. To get started, we talked about this trading empire. And you know, that's not just something that you do. It's not like you just walk out into the desert and start going and somebody says, okay, now, as soon as you find people, sell that to them. It doesn't work like that. You have to spend a lot of time and energy investing in how you're going to do this and where you're going to go and what you're going to do when you get there. What routes are you going to take? How long is it going to be? Do you have water? So this is the kind of national endeavor that requires a whole lot of really smart people who know what they're doing and have some experience and are organized and are pretty good managers and know how to find good camel drivers and donkey drivers and horse drivers and whatever they were using to haul this stuff around. So we're talking about people with imagination, ingenuity, inventiveness, and I think you can see that from the sort of things that I was showing you. How they used Egyptian material for their own benefit. I mean, they weren't really doing this out of some sort of fellow feeling with the Egyptians. They were getting something out of it. They were using their understanding of the other in order to further their own goals. And one of them was to keep their empire going and make lots of money, and the other one was to clean up that mess in Egypt because the Egyptians had just fouled it up. They were not religious enough anymore. There were all kinds of things happening up there that the Cushites appeared to disapprove of. So they're very tied to the Egyptians, but they're not tied in the sense of aping them. They're tied in the sense of we are, fellow participants in this. And you can tell from the stela of Piye that he goes up there and just tells people what to do. And he feels totally confident with that, and he seems to know exactly what needs to happen in order to get the infighting to stop and the right kind of king to be the head of this little town or that little town. And there is a shared history here, entanglements in the second paragraph. Boundaries were moving back and forth and leaving people together with towns that maybe it was the wrong religion, maybe it was the wrong culture, but they ended up getting mixed and families got mixed. And there's a lot of mixture of things happening here. So you never quite know who's necessarily a Cushite. They may have a Cushite name, but what if their mother was Egyptian or their father was Egyptian and he wanted them to have an Egyptian name? Well, this is the same thing that's happening in families all over the country right now. It's just a mix, and it's perfectly okay. It's how they did it. It's what they wanted. But if you use this Egyptian stuff, you can impress the people you're trying to sell to and deal with, and also your neighbors. Your neighbor looks and says, wow, you've got all that nice jewelry, and you're going to bury it? Oh, you must really be rich. That's impressive. And if the kings are flashing around looking like ancient Egyptian kings, the people that they're trying to bully around and maybe get some business with, those people are going to respect them more, because you better believe ancient Egypt was the biggest thing in the Near East for a long time, and everybody respected that. They had the best magic in town, or they would never have gotten where they were. So you wanted their magic, so you're going to use some of their stuff there. And when you see Piye behaving and saying, in essence, I'm doing this for your own good. You guys are messing up, and we have to straighten this out here. So this is not a culture that is copying Egypt at all. They're not. And we have to look beneath the surface. And I think of my mother all the time saying, don't form your opinion on the superficial appearance of something. go in and find out what the real truth is. And that's what we have to do with Cush. We have to stop saying, oh, that's Egyptian, I don't like it. Or, oh, that's Egyptian, I love it immediately. Because neither one of those is possible because it's not Egyptian. You got to take time and effort and give it that time and effort that it deserves as a self-standing individual culture that was a full participant in the ancient world and was successful for thousands of years. Who can say that we will be successful for that long? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. I think we have a question and answer session coming up now.
Please wait for a microphone, and one of us will get one to you for your question.
What influence did climate and weather conditions and climate, did it have any noticeable influence on the progress of the Kush and their development?
Well, that's kind of hard to say, but I think I think there's possibly an argument that could be made for that. There's certainly evidence that the Egyptians changed their environment to some extent by cutting down all the swamps and the places where the water of the Nile was kind of kept in holding areas. In Cush, we think they chopped down an awful lot of trees in order to fuel the fires that created the ironworking industry, that fired the pots in the ceramic industry. Certainly a certain amount of fire was necessary to do the gold mining because you set fire onto the rocks and then the rocks would crack. It was easier to move them. They were tearing up their environment as they were going. So there might be, yes, some especially self-caused environmental damage. Is that a successful answer? Okay. Other questions?
Did they have any of their own gods, or did they mainly?
I'm sorry. My hearing aids are coming in next week, but right now I haven't got them. Please shout at me.
Did they have any of their own gods, or did
Oh,
they?
yes, they did.
Okay.
Because the theme of my talk tonight was particularly, why does this look Egyptian and how can we explain this and understand them? I didn't talk about it, but there are a lot of native gods, and a couple of them the Egyptians apparently took. And of course, they took to some Egyptian gods too. So this was the mix that was going on in these cultures and points of contact all along the boundaries as the boundaries changed over hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. Yes, especially if you're not talking about the kings, what the individual people were doing was quite different from what the elite kings and tombs were doing in their tombs here. Extremely different. It's two different cultures, in fact.
You showed the trade routes, the roads they used for trade. Did they use much movement on the Nile within their own kingdom to move trade around, like shipping instead of by land?
I'm sorry, can I help with that question?
I'm sorry, you showed us the routes they used for trade with other kingdoms. Within their own kingdom, did they use the Nile to move trade?
Well, the Nile would be harder to use in the Sudan than in Egypt because it's got these cataracts, which are bands of much harder rock that it passes through. So when the water's not passing through a cataract, it's passing through much softer soil. It can spread out, it can flood, you can use a ship there. But when it's passing through a cataract, it's a rapid or a little waterfall. And you have to use portage around those areas, and there are 6 of them. So it makes a trip that shouldn't be very long into a horrendous thing of slogging huge wet boats around in 130-degree weather. That, at the beginning of the trade routes, I showed you the Carrasco Road, the Bayuda Road. Those are the 2 roads that were used to connect that S shape of the river so that you could avoid using the cataract areas you cut across the desert. And that was actually quicker and easier. So that was possible.
Any more questions?
To what extent have you been able to visit the area?
I'm so sorry. Could you repeat that?
To what extent have you been able to visit the area?
Oh, okay. Yes, I was in the Sudan myself in the mid-70s, and I did some research for my dissertation there. And then I went with a group of some people related from the museum and some other people for a trip a couple of years ago. I don't get a whole lot of support from my family about going to the Sudan. And I can't understand why. No, the truth is, it's perfectly okay. You stay by the river in the Nubia. Don't go wandering around in Darfur, but stay in the Nubian area, and it's really fine. And I'm hoping to go back. So I haven't been there nearly as much as an actual archaeologist would have been, because I spend much more time looking at texts, and I don't do archaeology, really. I read the results, but I don't get out there and dig the holes.
Did the Egyptians ever try to conquer the Cush, or vice versa?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Back and forth, back and forth. Remember, I put on a slide and I said that in 1550 BC, around 1550 BC, the Egyptians conquered Cush, and Cush was a colony of Egypt until around 1070. Before that and after that, there were periods of back and forth, back and forth. The boundary was just constantly moving. In the Egyptian second intermediate period, the Cushites were apparently in some sort of a co-federation with Asiatic troops in the Delta, and so they had Egyptian in this kind of squeezing vice. You know, the Asiatics coming down from the top and the Nubians coming up from the bottom, and that took the Egyptians a long time to get their way out of that. That was a problem. Yeah?
You talked about the difference and similarities between the elites in the 2 different cultures. Could you talk about the difference in the lower classes, given that they had a different kind of economy in both areas?
Right. Well, of course, there's never quite as much information. We know from Egyptian texts that there were, and we know just because we can see from the society, there were a lot of people in the trades, and they were not very well looked upon by elite Egyptians. I mean, they were considered get their hands dirty, and that's a bad thing. So they were paid mostly in food and sandals and fish and oil and things like that, and they did some really horrible work. And there was an awful lot of agricultural work, and apparently the kings would, in Egypt I'm talking about now, would kind of snap their fingers and say, all right, we're going to build me a pyramid right now, so your town, you send me this percentage of your young men, and we'll keep them for 6 months, and they'll work on my pyramid, and then they can go home. The actual details of this sort of thing are kind of fuzzy in everybody's mind, but yeah, there was an awful lot of physical work, and it was really hard and really horrible, and the medical papyri have records of people breaking arms and legs and getting terrible injuries, and they're clearly construction injuries, you know, for building something. So that would be the Egyptian lower classes. The lower classes in Kush, it's so hard to say because we hardly have any information about them. But there certainly were farmers. There were people slogging along on these caravans. There were an awful lot of pastoralists moving their cows and their goats through the landscape. And that's not a very pleasant life either. So people in the lower classes had it really tough, really tough. We can all be glad that, I mean, I keep saying, oh, if I could only go back. And my dad would always say, no, you don't like dirt. You want cold water. You want ice in your water all the time. You like your showers. You don't want to go back. And he was totally right. Somebody up there?
Thank you. I'm still trying to figure out how we get the names Cush and Nubia and where they come from and why that area has those two different names.
Oh, that's interesting. Kush is the Egyptian word for the area. So we're just taking the Egyptian word. And the Kushites call themselves Kushites sometimes too. So that's pretty clear. Remember the painted box of Tutankhamun with all the warriors being trampled by Tutankhamun's horse? The word Kush is on the box. That's where he is, and it's Kushites that he's killing. The word Nubia is a problem for linguists because they're not really sure. It's possible that it comes from the Egyptian word nub, which means gold. And that would make sense given that it was a land that provided gold in many different forms and in many different kinds of situations. But it may not be the real origin of the word. And Kush will have included some desert around, I think, because it's clear that some of the people who lived in Kush were pastoralists and were not settled, whereas Nubia is really lines the river. The Nubians are settled, urban-like people. They work on their farms, but they're perfectly happy to live in cities as well. And that's the area where the Aswan Dam has flooded a lot of Nubians out, and the new dam that's coming is going to flood a lot more out. And they are especially in danger from this because they are focused on living around the river. They're a riverine society. Does that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.